Okay. So this one that says double expansionary policies, what that means is our Federal Reserve Bank and our government, they don't work together. They make their own policies and they don't really talk to each other about it, which is not a really good thing to do. So when we're looking at these things, if we have a recession, the Federal Reserve Bank is going to do their thing, and the government, with taxes and government spending, they're going to do their thing at the same time. So what we need to do is see these two working simultaneously and compare to see what is the goal and if it's going to be met, right? So if we have a recession, what is our goal for unemployment? We want it to decrease, right? So the Federal Reserve Bank, with their board of governors, they say, okay, we want unemployment to go down as well. This is a recession. So now let's just trace our way through the thought process or what goes on with fiscal policy. Now this is a review from the earlier part of the worksheet, but this is what we need to do in order to compare, because they like these as multiple choice questions where they give you one column of fiscal policy, one column of monetary policy, and it'll say what necessarily happens. And so if you know that both of these make price go up or whatever, then that's what we're going to use this for, to compare those. So in a recession, we want taxes to decrease, makes consumption increase. That's going to make aggregate demand go up, GDP goes up, and what's our goal? Unemployment decrease. That's what we want. If they give you a scenario about the government spending, we need that to increase, which makes aggregate demand, GDP go up, unemployment decrease. So in this scenario, we have both of our expansionary policies. And that is the idea. This is our green, right? That's what we want. Now, the thing is, are we going to get matching results out of this? And what I mean by that is what's going to happen to price level and what's going to happen to GDP. So that's what we're looking for right here. So now when we go to in a recession, the monetary policy having a goal of low unemployment, what are they going to do with the reserve ratio? Well, they're going to lower that. It's going to make less required reserves for banks to keep in their vaults. That raises the excess reserves, or money that they can send out and loan. Then that's going to make the money supply go up. And we know with more money supply, that's going to make a lower nominal interest rate. And at low interest, people like to borrow. And when they go borrow, they invest it. And by investment, that means that they purchase capital goods to make consumer goods. They buy a house on the consumer side. And all this purchasing from low interest, this interest-sensitive consumption, is going to lead to aggregate demand increasing. So if that happens, unemployment decreases. So we have a match, don't we? So if unemployment decreasing is the goal of fiscal policy and monetary policy, then they can work together to make a recession go away a lot quicker. There are other things they can do is open market operation. They can buy bonds. And what kind of bucks does that make? Big bucks, that's right. So big bucks means the money supply goes up, and that makes interest rates drop, investment increases. That's going to make aggregate demand go up, and unemployment decrease. That's our goal. So if GDP is going up, that's a result. Price level is also going to go up, isn't it? Remember, we have our kind of whack-a-mole thing. If we hit one, if we drop unemployment, it's going to make price level go up. If we drop unemployment, it's going to make price level go up. So all these tools continue to do the same things. So these macro policy combinations, if all of a sudden we want the discount rate to be lowered, the Fed funds rate to be lowered, which they set at 0, like I said, in March of 2020, hoping to keep the economy rolling during that problem. Okay? So banks will see the discount rate and Fed funds rate when they borrow from other banks or from the Federal Reserve Bank. With that low rate, that's all that they pass on that savings to the consumer. So that's going to drop interest rates on both sides. That makes investment go up, aggregate demand goes up, and unemployment goes down. So now, the kind of questions they like to ask when they say, what is necessarily true of expansionary monetary and fiscal policy at the same time? You go, okay, well, I know these both work to get out of a recession, but they cause inflation and they cause inflation. So price level is inflation, GDP is tied to unemployment. So we get all these policy combinations to work, but these two things are going to happen whenever we have a recession. Now let's look at the opposite side. If we have inflation or an inflationary gap, the Federal Reserve Bank and our lawmakers are both going to approach this. And we know in real life politicians don't battle inflation because they don't get elected for slowing down the economy. But the Federal Reserve Bank, when no one notices, they do raise interest rates. And they actually did this in the Great Depression and made things worse. They decided, oh wait, this is getting bad, let's raise interest rates. And then banks stopped loaning to people, and businesses have working capital, which means they need money to operate all the time. And then they stopped loaning money, and there was also no money in the banks. Then the Federal Reserve didn't provide any money to the banks, and then the whole thing failed. Yeah, it was great. It was a terrible idea. All right, so the goal with inflation is to lower price levels with a contractionary policy, and that's the same thing the Federal Reserve Bank wants to do. So over here on fiscal policy, we know we need to raise taxes that lowers consumption, lowers aggregate demand, lowers GDP, and unfortunately, what does that do to unemployment? Makes it go up. Same thing happens with government spending. If we lower government spending, we don't shop in the product markets or the factor markets as a government. That's lower aggregate demand, lower GDP, and of course, higher unemployment. When there's high unemployment, we don't make GDP, that's going to make price levels drop, and that's going to make inflation drop. And those are our goals over here. So let's see, if the Federal Reserve Bank is enacting its policies on its own with inflation, they are going to raise the reserve requirements. And when they raise the reserve requirements, that means banks have larger required reserves, they have less excess reserves to loan out, the money supply shrinks, that makes interest rates go up, that drops investment, that drops aggregate demand, and unfortunately that makes unemployment go up. So all those scenarios right there, what we do know though, is aggregate demand drops, GDP is going to lower, and we're not producing things, we're not using resources and causing inflation. So our goals are starting to match up again. Inflation is defeated, inflation is defeated. The way they can do this another way is by selling bonds. So open market operations, sell bonds, make small bucks. And small bucks means a smaller money supply, which of course raises interest rates, then gross private investment, people don't want to borrow. That makes aggregate demand decrease, and that raises unemployment. But when aggregate demand goes down, GDP goes down. And when we're not making stuff, we're not causing inflation. So these things are working. The discount rate and the Fed funds rate, if they want to slow down investment, they're going to raise those. The Federal Reserve does. And that in turn is going to make the nominal interest rate increase. No one's going to borrow and invest. That's going to make demand go down because that interest-sensitive consumption is destroyed. And that's going to unfortunately cause unemployment. But once again, we get our policy goals. We get GDP to decrease, which is not the goal, but we get inflation to drop. Same thing over here. So anytime you see macro combinations of monetary policy and fiscal policy at the same time, just realize when they're doing the same goals, they're going to drop inflation, cause unemployment, or they're going to raise GDP and cause inflation.